Well, now that we've seen a few programming structures, I'd like to show you one thing about JavaScript that's brand new with HTML5, and it's also a great way to add some fun interactivity to our pages, and it's called drag and drop. With drag and drop, we're going to set up an element inside of our page to be draggable, and then we're going to allow our user to drop it onto something, and we can have JavaScript execute something. Typically, you could use this for launching a link or making some kind of a game or a shopping cart. Now, we're going to look at it in a very basic way first. I've got a file ready for us to try it out, so let's go ahead and close up the file we've been working on for the loops, and let's go to our working files and we'll open up the number 4 document, try drag and drop. Once again, I'll just open it up inside my browser, and I'll also open it up inside my text editor. In the browser, we can see this outline box here below the title, which is just a div, and we've got an image down below that. And if we go back over to our document, we can see the code that makes that up. First of all, there's my title. We've got a div here that's called target div. And if we take a quick look at the style settings for that, that's where our outline box is coming from. It's set to a width and height that matches the picture, and it has a margin left property that pushes it over 300 pixels, just so we have it kind of in the middle of the page here. Now below that, we can see the image has been given an ID of drag item. And other than that, it has normal properties of source, width, and height. Now the first thing we want to do is make our image draggable. In HTML5, there are actually a lot of items that are draggable by default, and images are one of them. But to make sure that our item is draggable, we're going to add the draggable property right to the HTML. So I'm going to go into this image line here, and we'll go right to the end after the width and height, and I'll add a new property called draggable. And we'll set that equal to true. Now if you go out to the browser, you should be able to grab a hold of and drag that image around, but that's about it. We can't drop it anywhere, and it just snaps right back to the position it was in before. So we're going to need a little bit more, and this is where our JavaScript comes in. To get all the parts of drag and drop to work correctly, we're going to need a few JavaScript functions. And the first one we're going to set up right here inside the image, and we're going to call it as soon as a user starts dragging the element. We've got an event for that. It's called onDragStart. And as you can see, it's kind of like onClick. We're going to set that equal to a function call. And we haven't written the function yet, but I'll go ahead and give it a name. We'll just call the function drag, so we know what we're doing. And what's different about this function is we'll need to pass it an event parameter that tells it about the drag operation. Now that sounds kind of confusing, but really all we need to do is add a parameter to the function call called event. I'll close off my quotes, and now on the onDragStart event, we'll be calling our drag event function. Guess we better write that drag event function. So let's go down to our script and start that out. I'll start off with the function keyword, and we've already chosen the name, drag. We need parentheses for normal functions, and this function is going to be passing a variable, so we need to have a variable name to catch it. And for that, I'm just going to use E, short for event. I'll close off my parentheses, and if you remember correctly, functions need grouping braces, so I'll add a brace and go down a line or two and close off that brace. Now you can have JavaScript do whatever you want when you start dragging the object, but at a minimum, I want to know which object the user's dragging. I'll just go ahead and write the statement that we're going to use, and then we'll go through what it's going to do. I'm going to take my E variable that we created, and I'm going to look at the data transfer, which is actually a fancy name for the drag operation. And I'm going to save the item that we're dragging. So I'm going to use the setData function. And what we're going to do is first give our data a name. I'll call it text. And then we'll talk about what our data is, and that is the dragged object. Well, in this case, I'm going to reference it by looking at the event E and calling off its target, and then specifying the ID of that target. I'll finish off my line with a semicolon, and now we can start thinking about the drop part of things. The first thing that we need to do is make sure that our page will allow our user to drop the picture onto the div. Normally, our users can't drop anything on an element in a web page, so we have to make sure that that's allowed. To set this up, let's go back over to our document, and this time I'm going to be working on the div called target div. Let me add an attribute to that one that will allow it to handle another event, and the event we're going to look for is called the onDragOver event. This event occurs whenever the user drags an item over top of this div. So we'll have JavaScript perform a function call when this event occurs. And I'm just going to call this function allowDrop. So we'll set an equal sign, and we'll set up quotes for our function name, and type in allowDrop. Now, of course, we'll need to write that allowDrop function, so let's go and set that up. I'll go down below the last function that we wrote in our script block, and I'll add another function. Let me scroll this up so we can see it a little bit better. And again, we're going to start with the function keyword. Our function name is allowDrop, so we'll set that up. And of course, like normal functions, we're going to need parentheses. This function also needs event data passed to it. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to go back up to our div statement, and we'll add parentheses to the allowDrop call here and add our event keyword again. And down in our function, I'm going to reuse that variable e, again meaning event. Now, an interesting thing about functions, you can use the same variable inside of each function, as long as the functions are separate. So I'll just set up grouping braces for this function that we've made. And we're going to need to add one more line of code to this function in order for it to allow dropping on that area. So inside the function, I'm going to write a statement that once again starts with my event variable e. And this time, I'm going to call a function called preventDefault. What this function does is it prevents the default behavior. And as we said before, the default behavior is not to allow a drop. So this function is going to allow our users to drop the item onto the div. That's all we need for this one. Now, for the last little piece, we need to decide what our JavaScript is going to do when the user actually drops the image onto the div. So we're going to set up one more event, and this one's going to go back to our div again. I'm going to add an event after the onDragOver event, and this time I'm going to use an event called onDrop when the actual drop occurs. Again, we need to set up a function, so I'm going to set it equal to, and we'll create a function called drop. This function also needs an event parameter, so I'll go ahead and set that up. And then we'll close it up and close the quotes. Now we can go back down to our script block, and we'll write that drop function as well. I'll set up the first part of it. Function keyword. The name of our function is drop. And we've got an event being passed to it, so I'm going to set up an e variable to catch it. We'll add some braces. And now we're ready to add the final part of our function. Now this function determines what happens when the user actually drops the item. And you can have all sorts of things happen. You could launch a link, show a picture, or add an item to a shopping cart. What we're going to do is we're going to add the item into the div itself so that it looks like it becomes part of the div. And that will be kind of a snap drop. Now, once again, we need to first prevent the default behavior. And the default behavior in this case is really nothing happening. So I'm going to set up a first statement in my function that says e, again my event parameter, and I'm going to say preventDefault. It's a function call, so we'll put parentheses, and I'll close off my line with a semicolon. Then we'll go back to our data transfer object, and we'll find out what object was being dragged. I'll create a variable called dragItem, and I'll set that equal to our event. And again, we're going to access data transfer to get information about the drag event. This time, we'll use getData, and we'll simply get the data by the name we gave it last time, which was text. Now, the item that we're dragging, the image, will be stored in our dragItem variable so we can access it with other JavaScript. The last thing for us to do is to actually move that image to its new location inside the div. So I'll add one more line of JavaScript down here at the bottom. And this line is also going to reference our event object, e. And we're talking about the target, which is the div. So I'll write .target. And we'll use a function call, .appendChild. This function actually adds the item to the div. Now all we have to do is tell it which item we're going to be adding. So I'm going to go to Document, and use our familiar getElementById function. And we'll give it the item in our variable that we just stored, drag item. Now I need to close the parentheses for the getElementById function call, and I also need to close the parentheses for the appendChild function call. You can see we're kind of doing two things at once in this statement. And now we have what it takes to complete a basic HTML5 drag and drop. It's time for us to save our changes and go check it out. I'll go back out to my browser and refresh the page. And what we'll do is we'll grab a hold of this image, and you can see that it is draggable. It shows up as a transparent version of the image while I have it held. Now I'm going to drag it over the div. And then I'm going to let go and drop. And you can see, as a user, I was able to move an image on the page from one location to another just by dragging it.